few videos, we're going to take a deeper look at creating bevels or chamfers in 3Dcoat's Voxel workspace. As you may have noticed, when you're trying to create bevels or chamfers in this environment, there is no dedicated bevel or chamfer tool. And a new user might be a bit frustrated with that. Well, the pose tool in 3Dcoat has evolved into what you might consider an advanced transform tool. If you want to create Boolean type of effects, you have tools that are more dedicated for that purpose. But for applying advanced transformations to either an entire object or a portion of an object, the pose tool is the first one you're going to want to lean on. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to start off with a primitive shape type of object, and then we're going to move on to something that's a little bit more challenging. After that, we'll go into a more practical example, such as a weapon for a game project. Okay, so let me hide this one object and the other. We'll start with this primitive here. And as you probably do in your standard 3D application, you typically make selections from an orthographic view. So in 3Dcoat, you just go to the navigation bar and click on this little cube icon. You could alternatively hit the 5 key on your number pad to toggle in and out of perspective and orthographic views. Okay, so I'm going to go back to orthographic here, and we can go to our camera menu and choose the different view that we want to work in. From here on, I'll just use my number keys. Okay. I'll zoom in here, and what I like to do is create a camera shortcut. Once I move about my model to inspect the result, I may want to come back to a specific angle. I'll go back to a front view here, line it up, and I can go to the camera menu and choose create a camera shortcut here. Control up arrow on your keyboard. Okay, so with that done, the next thing I want to point out is in 3Dcoat, you have what's called a 2D grid that helps facilitate making very elaborate or precise selections. So here in the View menu, you want to check Show 2D Grid. I assigned hotkeys to both of these, Show 2D Grid and Snap to 2D Grid, because we're going to be going in and out and toggling these quite frequently, so it really helps. You can do that by hitting the End key on your keyboard, that's END. Now you can assign it whichever hotkey combination you like. Okay, I'll hit Escape because I already have it assigned to something. Okay, so with that done, let's go to the Pose tool. We can move down to the Adjust section of the tool panel. You see the Pose tool is close to the middle. Or alternatively, you could stay here in the viewport and hit the space bar, and that will bring your tool panel up in the center of the viewport here. We're basically centered on your mouse or your cursor. Okay, so let's choose the Pose tool. All our options reside now in the Tool Options panel, and in the upper right hand corner you can choose the selection type. For this particular purpose, the line method works best. Now if I wanted to make a selection here toward the center, I might choose ring. You can make a spherical selection, select with pen, which you could use a brush, or you could use any one of these marquee selection types. Okay, and that even includes a brush alpha, and use maybe a stamp draw mode to make a selection that way, and then you could apply a specific transform just to that shape. Okay. Another option is you could load a shape, which would be an image. So 3Dcoat is going to try to create a selection based on grayscale values. So if you have an alpha of some type, that's a good option. Or if you have an Illustrator file, if you save it out as an EPS, you can bring it in. If you export from Illustrator as an EPS file, 3Dcoat will immediately recognize it as a shape. And so you can bring that shape in and, again, apply advanced transforms to that. So just something to keep in mind, but we're going to use the line tool here for beveling. So I'll just click the start point and I can drag up to the end of the object. Now sometimes I like to actually go over and extend beyond, because if I end at the very edge of the object, the default curve, let me go ahead and switch to that. I'm going to choose default. I hit OK. That S-curve that we saw is basically the shape of the bevel that we're going to get, and we may not want that. So let me try again. We want to make sure we select the curve first before we select. Okay, not the other way around. So let's just choose clear selection. Alternatively, you could clear selection just as you would in Photoshop by hitting the Control-D keyboard combination. So I'm going to move my grid down a little bit. Alright, so with that S curve chosen, I'll click and start, drag and end at the very edge of the object. I'm going to hit my hotkey to toggle off the 2D grid temporarily. I'll make the scale, and you can see we have basically that S curve here. If I flip it to the opposite side, you can basically see that little S curve just as we saw it. Okay, represented here. So just keep that in mind. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo, clear that selection. I'm going to hit Control right arrow to go back to my camera shortcut. I'm going to hit my hotkeys for the 2D grid. And this time, I'm going to keep this same S-curve. And I'm going to show just a quick and dirty trick, once again, to make this a more rounded fall-off curve. So, as I mentioned before, sometimes I like to go beyond. Instead of stopping right on the edge, I like to go beyond somewhat. And you'll notice the red portion of this gradient is no longer there. So really you just have a nice blend between 0 and about 70% strength or influence. So let me hit the hotkey for the 2D grid, scale it in, and now basically it clipped off that part that started to create, go back in the other direction. So we can use that technique to kind of create a more rounded bevel. Okay, so I'm going to undo, go all the way back, and then clear the selection, and I'll Control right arrow to go back to my camera shortcut, hotkey for 2D grid. And instead of using this trick, you might try and create a different curve shape. And so what you do with 3D Code, just like you would in Photoshop, you can just click on a point along the spline and it will lay down a control point for you. By default, initially, this is a standard spline curve. The spline will run through the point and there will be a certain measure of curvature, but if you right click once, now you'll notice you have a hard edge. Okay. Right click once more over the top of that, and now instead of that spline flowing through the point, it's weighted. It's a B-spline. Okay. So now we can create a much more soft and rounded edge just right off the bat this way. You can save it and reload it as you need. Okay, create multiple shapes here and save it in your My Documents directory, 3D Coat, and then splines. So by default 3D Coat will try to save it here. That's okay. So now when we make our selection, I can stop right on the edge, hide my 2D grid, scale, and now I have that nice rounded edge there. So hit Control D to deselect. I'm going to go to a top view here to make another selection. And I may create another camera shortcut here. And the next thing I'm going to do is change the selection type to select with pen. And in the E panel, I can hit the E key to bring it right to my cursor instead of having to reach to the left side of the interface each time. And choose a closed spline draw mode. And I could change the point type as I'm actually creating these. So for example, I could right click and harden that edge as I'm working. So I'll create one, and if I want to, I can go back and right click until it's a hard edge. I'm just going to put that one right on top of that first spline point. And add another point onto the spline here. Okay, so with that done, I'll go back to my camera shortcut, and I should be able to just hit the Enter key and make that selection. If I want, I can save that spline, and I can also save this pose selection. But just keep in mind, if you're in surface mode, it's very easy to change the vertice order because you're working with dynamic subdivision or reduction. So that will kind of negate a saved pose selection if you want to get back to it later on. So you might instead try voxel mode. But we could save that here. Instead of splines, you want to probably put it in the pose presets. Okay. I can reset the axis to reorient the gizmo here. Okay, so I'm going to hit the escape key to drop that spline, and just go ahead and start modifying this object. Skipping forward just a little bit, I want to try and create something rather interesting by using a mask to cut out a part of the selection. So I'll switch to a medium brush alpha here, and just freeform lasso will be fine, or ellipse. So I'm going to hold the Control key, kind of deselect. Okay. So we cut that out. We can bring our gizmo back up, reset the axis. So what I'm going to do, go back before I make a transformation here, and I may choose smooth the selection just a bit. And now when we transform, there we go, much better. Scale back in. Let's clear the selection. Okay, so pretty cool. Okay, I'm now going to speed up the playback on this next example because we're just going to look at the freeform deformation capabilities inside the pose tool whenever you want to tackle something that's a little bit more challenging. For example, this particular object has non-uniform sides, so it's a little bit more difficult trying to get a bevel on an object like this. So I'm using a deformation cage that's 4x4, and I'm using the freeform lasso draw mode to drag select points and just make some quick edits in the areas that is a little bit problematic. You can also just transform the entire lattice. I'm using it to reorient it to a different area here. So we'll finish up with this particular example and start with one more in the next video, so stay tuned and thank you for watching.